So I'm Sandy Pentland, MIT. Work with Sinan and other wonderful people. And I'm going to be moderating this session. So, and I'm going to stay away from these microphones because they seem to be feedback and so forth. So we're going to start off this last session with two speakers. They're going to talk each for about 15 minutes with a question or two in between. And then we'll discuss it up here, and you can give us a hard time. When you give us a hard time and ask questions, don't do it from your seat. Speak into one of those microphones, because we want to record your comments for posterity and maybe blackmail. No, we're not going to do that. But do speak into the microphones. Okay, and then we're between you and the reception, so let's get started. So the first speaker is Donald Rubin from Statistics Department, Harvard. And we were just talking about how MIT hasn't gotten it together to get a statistics department yet, but we're trying. And he's going to talk about balanced 2 to the k factorial experiments and ReRandomization for increased precision. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a kind of an unusual event for me, because I am a statistician primarily and only sort of dabble in some of these areas, although I have done stuff on some algorithms over the years. But the thing that I'd like to talk about today is very briefly introduce the idea of something that's in design, which I think is not typically a topic in machine learning context, but historically is very important in statistics. The idea of doing experimental design to increase precision in advance, rather than doing a lot of sort of data mining afterwards to get at answers. And one of the ideas of experimental design, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is there are many classical textbooks on experimental design, and many of them deal with changing many factors at the same time. And one of the designs is called the 2 to the k factorial design, where you have k factors, where k could be up to 10, 20, or 30. So if you look at each at one of 2 levels, that's why it's 2 to the k. So you have, with 10 such factors, you have like 1,000 different treatment conditions. And sometimes you have many more factors than that. Sometimes it's 20 factors. So when you're trying to do things like, one example I'm involved in is trying to convert stem cells to beta cells, to pancreatic beta cells, to quote, cure childhood diabetes, for example. And so you have maybe 20 factors, each at one of 2 levels. That's a lot of factors. There's a lot of treatment conditions. And you obviously cannot look at all of them at the same time. And there are ideas that I'm not going to talk about now, but fractional factorials, like how to choose the particular treatment combinations and how to do response surface technology to get there more quickly, because even in the era of big computing, those are a lot of factors. Another sense of big data, besides the number of factors, is the number of background covariates, the number of descriptors of the different units in an experiment that you may want to try to control. Now, in industrial settings, very often there's very little variation from unit to unit, from the physical object to physical object, and you don't really care that much about how you do the randomization. But in a lot of medical experiments and social science experiments, there's tremendous variability from unit to unit. Certainly when you're dealing with people, they vary tremendously, not only in their attitudes like age, sex, race, other such things, but also their experience. And so you might get very different results, and so you'd like to get reliable results. What this talk is going to very briefly introduce is an idea that I think probably occurred to the originators of experimental design in 75 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but is kind of recondite in the sense that it was never developed, primarily because of computation, I think. And I think that a lot of these guys were very smart, and if they had computation available now, they would have done something different. They wouldn't have written all these textbooks about the classical experimental designs. I think in a lot of ways, classical experimental design, as studied by statisticians, is in some sense outmoded, and it's time to move on. And this is sort of an origin of the idea, meaning the origin of the idea as I'm presenting it here, was basically my PhD advisor was a well-known Scottish statistician who wrote books on survey sampling and experimental design, named Bill Cochran. And this is back from my graduate school days in the late 60s, where, let's suppose you did a randomized experiment, and the chosen randomized allocation. So you do one, and you have 1,000 units across these 2 to the k conditions. And what if the randomized allocation exhibited substantial imbalance on a prognostically important baseline covariate, like age? Let's say or sex. All the men got one treatment of the high level of this factor, and all the women got the low level. So somehow estimating the effect of that factor, high versus low, is in some sense completely confounded with sex. So you don't like that design. In fact, when you talk about experimental designs, it's very hard to describe what a good one is. It's very easy to describe what bad ones are. And so you want to get rid of the bad ones and end up with a good one. And so the classical textbooks are full of experimental designs that enforce balance by choosing from a limited subset of allocations in particular ways. For example, Latin squares or hypo-Greco-Latin squares are balanced in complete blocks or partially balanced in complete blocks, or fractional replications. All these designs that fill up hundreds and hundreds of pages of textbooks over and over again talk about how you do the randomized allocation from a limited subset. But what they're really trying to do is eliminate bad randomizations. So this was a conversation that I had with my advisor, Cochran. Said, you did an experiment and you did one randomization and you didn't like it. So what do? Well, according to all the theory, all the mathematical theory that underlies all the tests and p-values that almost everybody uses, f-tests, t-tests, significance levels, you keep it. You keep the bad allocation, because it's balanced off against the bad allocation the other way. That's how you get unbiasedness. And so I get all these statistical properties. But that's kind of silly, isn't it? Because you look at the data and you know you're going to get a bad answer, or an unreliable answer. And the fact that if you did it over and over and over again, this one bad answer would trade off against another bad answer and give you the right properties mathematically, it's sort of you're hiding behind the mathematics. And if you like mathematics, do the mathematics and don't do statistics. So Cochran responded something, well, why didn't you balance on there, block on that variable? In other words, if it's sex, why didn't you do one randomized experiment for males, divide them in half, another randomized experiment for females, divide them in half? That's what you should have done. Well, there are many baseline covariates. For example, age, sex, race, the experience doing Google. How many hours a day do you spend or do you do it at night? Do you do it to the afternoon? All these kind of factors can be important in making the assessment. So there are many baseline covariates, and the correct blocking wasn't obvious, and I was lazy at the time. So you have to think, and nobody likes to think very hard, especially in advance of knowing there's a problem. They just try it and say, oh, that's okay, and then you go on. Cochran responded, this is a question that he once asked Ronald Fisher, who's in the 20s, invented a lot of these original ideas in experimental design, such as randomization. And his reply, Fisher's reply, was unequivocal. Of course, if the experiment had not been started, I would re-randomize. And when you talk to people in social science, some of my co-authors, for example, like Josh Ingres, who's here at MIT, who's an economist, who does randomized experiments all the time, he re-randomizes. Did he tell anybody? No. Did Fisher tell anybody? No. But that's what they would do. They wouldn't live with a bad answer. They would pretend like they just happened to get a good allocation, and they would go forward. But how do you deal with that? Well, this was a thesis topic that I gave to a PhD student, very good PhD student, Carrie Morgan, and she wrote a PhD thesis on this, and we recently published an article in the Annals of Statistics, I think it was 2012, which is our mathy stat journal. And as often happens, what you see when you enter a new area that's a good area but hasn't been explored, there are a lot of low-hanging fruit. You just pluck these fruit, because if you knew a little bit about linear algebra and a little bit about geometry, there's all these obvious results. You just fall out. And the title of this talk has something else in it, that all these results I'll be talking about here for a treatment control experiment generalize to a 2 to the k factorial experiment. Because a 2 to the k factorial experiment, you're always comparing half the factors at the high level, half the observations at the high level of the factor with half the observations at the low level of the factor. And if you're talking about one factor, those are the main effects. If you're talking about two factors, high and low, those are two-way interactions. Three factors, high, low, the product of them, those become the three-way interactions, and so forth. And they generalize to 10-way interactions. So a balanced factorial design, which is in the title, is just a very simple, mathematically trivial generalization of a two-group randomized experiment. Because you can deal with +1 and -1, you can deal with half the pluses ones and half the minus ones. There's some extensions, but they're trivial. So this is supposed to be just a motivation of the idea. And obviously, the more covariates you have in this era of big data now, you can have lots of covariates. You may have 100 that you want to balance, or 200, and maybe some of them are important to some factors, and maybe others are more important for other factors. In fact, the more covariates you have, even in the treatment control setting, the more likely it is that at least one covariate will have imbalance across the treatment groups. So with just 10 independent covariates, the probability of a significant difference at 0.05 level for at least one covariate is about 50%, 40%. So it's likely if you have a lot of covariates, and with big data, you can have a lot of covariates. That's the fact. You have a lot of factors, and you have a lot of covariates. So this imbalance is not limited to rare, unlucky randomizations. It's going to happen all the time. And so you'd like to eliminate that a priori if you can. And the gold standard, as we have been talking about for a few days, randomized experiments really are the gold standard for estimating causal effects. Why? Well, two obvious reasons is they yield unbiased estimates. Averaging over all possible randomizations, you get the right answer. And they eliminate confounding factors on average, but they don't do it in any particular allocation. You do a randomized experiment, you get one allocation. You don't get to go back and do it 1,000 times. But that's what the theory is all about. So any particular experiment, covariate imbalance is possible and likely, and conditional bias exists, meaning that you're going to get the wrong answer in this experiment. Conditional on the values of the covariates. All the females got the high level, all the males got the low level. Is that unbiased? Not really. Sorry, wrong button. And one measure of balance is to set limits on the acceptable balance for each covariate individually. Like age should be, the mean age for the males should be, I didn't say that right. The average number of males in the treatment group should equal the average number of females in the control group, plus or minus some percentage, or the average age in the treatment. So what this is a plot of two artificial covariates who are normally distributed, and the points of the difference in means between treatment group and a control group across, I think, maybe 200 randomizations. So the center, the 0, 0 is when the mean on these two normally distributed covariates, when the means in the treatment group and the control group are the same. And when you get farther and farther out, the means are more and more different. So a bad randomized allocation is one that's out in the extremes. As probably you all know, as the dimensionality gets bigger and bigger, how many points lie in an interior relative to on the surface? All the points lie on the surface as you get bigger and bigger. So everything's a disaster in some sense. So you want to control that. And so the boxes, if you applied an individual criteria to each of the two covariates, like proportions for males and females, and their average ages or something else like that, the ellipse is the affinely invariant measure. And we'll see there's certain advantages to that, and I won't go into those details. But the idea is to get rid of the bad allocations and live with the randomizations, for example, that are within the ellipse. And as you get more and more covariates, that ellipse is going to have to get smaller and smaller because there's more and more likelihood that things are far away. And so one criteria for acceptable balance is called Mahalanobis distance, which is an affinely invariant measure, which is basically you do Graham-Schmidt orthogonalization of all the covariates after making them look sort of normal, and then take Euclidean distance. How far from 0, 0 is the allocation you got. And an affinely invariant metric like this is actually kind of useful because it has certain properties that you can easily work with. For example, you can calculate how many randomizations you're going to have to do before you get an acceptable one as a function of the number of covariates, and because means over the randomization distribution are essentially normally distributed very quickly. So even if it's a discrete covariate, the central limit theorem's effect kicks in very, very quickly, and these covariate means, the treatment group and control group, are jointly normal, and you can get a formula basically like this. Here's the distribution of this affine, how far, maybe go back a second. I thought this went back, I guess it doesn't. Okay, which one do I, to go back one? Good, one more, sorry. One more? Thanks. So what we want to do is basically using an affine metric like this pulls in all the points in some equivariant ways. So they're pulling in the means towards each other, and you're pulling in the ellipsoids as well. And so you do it, I'll just very quickly do it. So here you'd re-randomize if the distance is too great, and otherwise you accept it. And this, in this condition to re-randomization, very quickly, and this works for very relatively small sample sizes, has a closed form expression, known distribution, affinely invariant, and it's, oh yeah, do we have the formula? I guess I don't have the formula. But so this is an example, a real example with 10 covariates. It was a published paper, and the blue lines are pure randomization. I just randomly assigned half the people to one group and half the people to the other group, and the red describes re-randomized, because I think maybe accepting the 5% acceptable randomizations where the distance between the treatment control means is small. And so the idea is here, if you're going to be in a position of choosing one randomization from the blue to live with, or one randomization from the red, which would you prefer? It's pretty obvious, because you don't have to rely on other linear model adjustments if there's very little distance. So that's the essential idea, and the issues are that it takes computing time to do this. So why didn't people do it before? Who had computing time? But is there any reason not to do this now? Not really. So basically, there's a theorem that said if you choose the sample sizes in the two groups to be the same, and the covariate means are normally distributed, and you randomize when this Mahalanobis metric is bigger than some constant, you can actually see how much precision increase you get, which is a function of the incomplete gamma function. And so the only thing I want to say in addition, because my time is up, is to say that this whole idea generalizes to 2 to the k factorial experiments and other experiments as well. The math has been done for 2 to the k because it's simple and it's completely generalizes from stuff that's here. But extending this to more complicated settings, we have different sample sizes, and non-normal distributions really is much of an issue, but many different kinds of factors, some at 3 levels, some at 2 levels, some at 5 levels, because there's all this neat theory underlying fractional replications having to do with rings and fields. So thanks for your attention.
We could have a question or two while Karim comes up and gets himself set. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So you mentioned, is there any reason not to do this? And then you say no. So
I don't see any reason not to do it.
So in online settings, assignment is often done as people hit the website.
Correct.
So then re-randomization can be quite tricky, can it not?
Not necessarily. We have one paper that generalizes this when you have tiers of covariates of varying importance. We just break up this Mahalanobis distance into subspaces, into, like you do the Graham-Schmidt thing, and you have subspaces that are orthogonal, add up the distances that way. And also there's another paper that's not complete yet, having to do with the sequential setting, just like you described. And that sequential setting, we've already applied it to a real study in the Netherlands on the female diagonal,
Sure.
where patients are arriving in time. And
Okay.
you have to randomize them in maybe groups of 6.
Okay, one super short one.
You motivated the talk with a comment from your advisor saying, well, why didn't you block? So, we could just divide up all the covariates into blocks and then randomize within each one. Why do you feel like this is better than that?
Well, if you have continuous covariates, you have to, for example, the blocking suggestion, you have to discretize them, and you have to think harder. I think it's easier to see, and you lose the affine invariance because you're making little boxes.
Yep.
So do you really want to, I mean, what I want to do is I want to take this ellipse, which is, 500 dimensional, and just take a smaller version of it that's tighter around 0, 0. And you're putting all these intersecting boxes on it, and you have all these corners. Do you really want all those corners that are very, very far away? Because that's what you're left with if you do that.
Great. Okay, good. So, thank you.
Yep.
So the next talk is Should We Go to the Crowd First? By Karim Lakhani from up the street again.
So thanks for the invitation. This talk has now to rethink the experiments under design right now. So thank you for that, Don. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the work we've done in running field experiments for a bunch of different partner organizations around innovation. But then there's a message for our research community as well. So the basic message is, and I'll show you sort of in my experience in working with crowds to solve tough innovation problems, we find that the solutions from the crowds tend to reliably be cheaper, faster, and better than what the internal solutions are from elite institutions. And I'm going to provide a very simple statistical explanation for why that is the case. And for a range of distributional assumptions about the quality of the outcomes, we can find that as small as 22 independent draws from the distribution can get you a very, very robust, high-quality answer. And that the additional benefit that we sort of don't model but actually shows up is that we see many different approaches to solve the same problem. And the question that I raise for us is, how might we use crowds for our own collective research agenda in terms of pushing the algorithms and the computational work that we're trying to do here. So my work has, it's a bit cut off there. My work has basically shown that we can organize crowds in two distinct institutions. There's contests and there's communities. I'm going to just focus in on the contest side, which is basically lots of independent people working to solve a problem and competing to solve it in this way. What's great about the contest literature is that there's a ton of models, right? Ton of models out there in economics that tell us how to optimally design contests. And in great, high-end top 5 publications, textbooks, and so forth that discuss these things. But while there's a lot of models, there's a lot of theoretical work. Empirical evidence lags theory. Both sort of at the policy level, at the National Science Foundation, at the U.S. government level, people are saying, okay, we see all these great models, but we don't have great empirical evidence. And then also scholars have also come in and said that while there's a cottage industry of people writing models and doing empirical work, there isn't that much great empirical evidence for it. So about 5 years ago, I established what was then called the NASA Tournament Lab, and it's now called the Crowd Innovation Lab, where we could partner with leading organizations to take their real innovation challenges, mostly in the computational domain, and then use crowdsourcing platforms like TopCoder and Innocentive to actually get them solved. At the same time, we could run our own digital online field experiments to see how the theory models worked and didn't work, and in fact, go at causal answers. Over the last 5 years, we've run over 700 challenges through these platforms, and we've run about 11 large-scale, randomized experiments to get at a whole bunch of questions. One of the reasons why we've got to work with NASA and the medical school and Scripps Research Institute and Pfizer and so forth has been that everybody, and we all live this, everybody's sort of now living in a world of lots of data. So in the medical world, there's sense that as we do more and more genomic work, we're going to go from petabytes to exabytes of data. So just a huge explosion of data that we all sort of live with now. Secondly, there's a labor market shortage, right? There aren't enough data scientists around. We're all setting up programs to train data scientists, but there's a massive shortage of data scientists. McKinsey, estimates about 1.8 million missing data scientists by 2020. That's McKinsey, right? But at least I have a number to go with. The second thing, which is actually more interesting, is that there is now intense competition also for data science talent, right? So it's no longer just one part of the economy that needs these people. Everywhere you go, everybody's hungry for data scientists, right? So the medical school, right, here in Boston has to compete not only with Pfizer and Merck and all those kind of people, but also Google, right, and Facebook and Twitter, right? Our best data scientists are helping us click ads instead of trying to help solve for cancer problems, right? And so this is also a concern. And so when I show up and say, look, I can potentially access these folks to help us solve these problems, people are excited by it. But then I think the thing that actually matters to us more is that the approaches needed to solve these data challenges keep changing. The frontier of research is expanding broadly. We keep innovating, which is great. We keep innovating on the different algorithms that could be used to do a whole range of different tasks at hand. So any one person or any one sets of expertise that could potentially solve this problem may not be applicable given the changing nature of the problems that we're going after. So these are all great challenges, and what we've tried to do is say, well, could we use online platforms and contests to solve these solutions? So let me just give you a quick video example of a challenge we recently solved with NASA to give you a sense of what the problems are, and then I'll give you some answers as well.
Energy, in one form or another, powers everything on Earth, and the man-made things floating above it, too. This is the International Space Station. You've probably heard of it. It's powered by the sun, and the sun's energy is captured by the station's solar panels. Ensuring the space station harvests the most energy possible is a complicated task. Why? Well, for one reason, see those large solar panels? Holding them to the station are very long, thin arms called longerons. Anytime an odd number of longerons are in full sunlight, with others in the shadows cast by the rest of the space station, they bend and eventually break. For this reason, ISS operators are careful to position the station to limit shadowing, and so only an even number of longerons are shadowed at one time. However, this conservative positioning reduces the power the station can collect from the sun, thus causing inefficiency. NASA wants more power for the ISS. More power means more science and cool stuff that NASA can do on orbit. NASA needs a sophisticated algorithm, and they think you just might be the key to this whole equation. Introducing the NASA Tournament Labs International Space Station Longeron Challenge. Your solutions just may help power the International Space Station and allow more science from more scientists around the world. Consider this your invitation to blast off with NASA. For more information, visit topcoder.com/ISS. if you've got the right stuff.
So this was a 2-week-long challenge, 30K in prize amounts. This amount, like you can't even buy a space toilet for this amount, right? So it's a very small number in terms of the impact on NASA's budget. Here's what happened. We had over 2,000 people sign up, and 459 competitors submitted code from around the world over this 2-week period. 2,000 code submissions altogether. The top guy is Italian. The second person is Chinese, Polish, Chinese, Belarusian, Chinese, Canadian, Chinese, Estonian, right? So broad ranges of awesome solutions coming in. The Chinese are doing really great. That's awesome. So we gave them the awards based on the performance of the code, right? So on the y-axis, I'm showing you the power output, and the x-axis is simple rank ordering by solution type. The thing, though, you want to look at is the counterfactual, like how good is the NASA solution? The NASA solution is right there, right? This is the internal NASA solution developed with their contractors, Boeing. They spent 3 years. NASA gives $20 million a year to Boeing to access the solution, and we got it done in 2 weeks for 30K, right? And so this sort of gives you a hint as to what's going on. Similar thing here. NASA cares about planetary defense as well. If you've read the latest Neil Stephenson book, Seven Eves, right? There's a whole subplot about that, right? And if you didn't know, 556 asteroids have actually penetrated our atmosphere the last 20 years. So there's a big program out of University of Arizona to go look at the telescope images that come through, and then to automatically classify objects that are moving as potential asteroids. We ran a challenge to go after this. We had about 47 competitors and 256 code submissions. It was a $5,000 challenge. Here's what we discovered here again. So we increased detectability by 10% and dropped the false positives by an order of magnitude, okay? Again, these people don't have any special skills in astronomy or astronomical measurement. We basically gave them the data, told them the parameters of the problem, and they went at it, okay? We discovered that crowds are smarter than Harvard Medical School as well. So we ran a challenge around sequence alignment in immunogenomics. Again, just look at the prize amounts, right? $6,000 over 2-3 weeks. And we're just trying to improve both how fast you could do this task and also the accuracy. Again, the numbers, again, look the same, about 122 coders submitted. We also discovered 89 different approaches to solve the problem versus the fact that in the academic literature we had about 6. And winners from Russia, France, Egypt, Belgium, and US. The graphic is more shocking. So the x-axis shows you how fast you could get 100,000 sequences done. It's log, right? And the y-axis represents the score, like how accurate you are. 0.8 is the theoretical maximum in this data set. The red dot represents the NIH solution, okay? The yellow dot represents my co-author, Rami Arnaud, undergrad from MIT, PhD from Oxford, associate professor at Beth Israel, right, and his lab. And then these are all the guys from our contest, right? And none of them had any computational biology experience as well. The last result I'm going to show you was the one that sort of gave me pause, because I kept seeing this. We did the same thing with scripts, antibody sequence clustering. Again, look, very small numbers, right? The script solution here could do clustering with 100,000 sequences on a pretty fat server over 2 hours. And when these numbers came in, I thought for sure this was wrong, right? The contest solution then basically could do 2.3 million sequences on a laptop at 30 seconds, right? Again, these are not like useless institutions, right? Like Harvard, Scripps, NASA, and so forth. So these are elite institutions with elite folks solving these problems. And again, nothing in the world should give you this level of productivity, like 20x increase in capacity, 10,000x increase in speed, 10x memory efficiency. That should not be happening for this low amount of dollars and for this kind of stuff. Regardless, we get this. So the key insight that we've sort of come is that contests provide us with incentives, right? But they also enable parallel search, right? And it's this parallel search is what we can now exploit and learn from and put into practice. So the simple statistics is this, and this is sort of the bulk of this perspective, is that what contests allow us to do is find extreme value solutions. Just imagine a distribution of outcomes, right? If you do a task by itself one time, you'll get the average value, but if you have lots of parallel independent draws, right, the likelihood of you finding the extreme value becomes higher. It's as simple as that. And we've taken this insight and we've said, well, let's actually go there and actually do the math. Like, this is a very rudimentary modeling exercise to actually show you that this actually works really well. And so this is with Michael Minetti, who's a research scientist in my lab. So you can just imagine, there's some distribution F under which the quality of outcomes is being distributed, right? If a single, crowd member works, right, you just get this one draw. If n members engage in the activity, right, you get the best outcome is distributed as F to the power of n. And then what you want to do is you want to compare it to, right, what happens as one person within the quality of the internally developed solution, right? And we want a crowd solution that is as good as the internally developed solution with some probability. And we can take this very rudimentary model and basically come up with an equation that basically allows us to say, what's the level of n you need to get a certain distribution of performance as well as probability, right? This is like, again, I'm embarrassed to show this to you, right? This is very simple math being put out there. And what we find, right, is this, on this contour plot is, if you think about Q quality, right, percentile of the quality distribution, and the probability you'll get this, right, for any distribution, right? No, I'm not making any assumptions whatsoever. What we discover is that, for 95% probability, if you get between 25 to 30, you're approaching 90th quantile and 90% quantiles in the quality distribution. And if you get 50, you're like way. Anyway, it seems this sort of, for me, has provided, because we keep getting these extreme value solutions over and over again, this at least provides me with some solace that this is purely a statistical artifact that we can put to use. We've done, in the paper that we're just finishing up, we've now looked at a whole range of distributions, exponential, uniform, beta, normal, chi-square, and what we find is that, at about 11 to 13 draws, you're at the sort of the expected value goes up to, about 95th quantile, okay? So again, rudimentary math showing us why this works. But, the thing is, you might still say, if I present this to NASA, right, they say, well, yeah, the crowd on average is probably going to be dumber than my expert, right? Our distributions are right shifted. You guys on the left side. I go, fine, that's okay. But again, if you just think through the logical math, if you just picked one person from the traditional experts, right, they'll be here. But because I get to see the entire distribution, I still win, right? Because no company is going to allow for parallel search inside, right? For the types of projects I showed you, right, NASA's not going to unleash 30 teams to work independently, right? But I can, given the incentive structure of the contest, I can actually get that going. So I'm not making any social welfare arguments here. I'm just saying that here's the pure math around this. And so what we find is that, sorry, the top of the slides are cut off. What we're basically finding is, for the normal distribution, right, if you have assumptions about, what sigma is for the normal distribution, and you think about how many draws you get from it, what we find is that we can get, as you increase the sigma, so as you increase the variant, the tails of the distributions, for normal, what we see is that, you can get, with 11 draws, you can get a 3 sigma solution, right, quite easily, right? And it keeps, so what this comes back to me is saying, what we have discovered in this work has been that as we unleash lots of people to work on the problem, we can find great, robust solutions, and also awesome diversity of approaches. So the potential lessons for our research community, include, like, there's more and more data that we're dealing with, right? I tell my students, there's not going to be a time where we're going to have less data to work with, right? So we have more and more data that we're working with. We need efficient computer algorithms, and we need diverse approaches to research problems. Maybe we should start with the crowd first. Like, as we sort of think about the computational algorithms that's going to power our work, you could hire one postdoc to work on that, and you'll get some quality of solution. Maybe what you want to do is, let's go get a whole bunch of solutions. Most likely you'll get an extreme value solution, and that becomes, that's also cheaper, faster, and better, and potentially you can incorporate these diverse solution approaches in your answers. So I think the challenge for us is, how might we do this collectively instead of just my lab working on it on itself. So with that, I'll stop.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
So we have one question here, and then we should all get up and sit on our little chairs here.
Sure.
And then my goal is to ask obnoxious questions.
Great.
Eric.
Karim.
Yeah.
Great talk, as always. The one benchmark is how effective this is relative to the cost or other people. Another benchmark is the total number of hours that went into it, and so maybe sort of a more apples to apples is that if there were 100,000 hours of various people, some of which were unpaid or whatever.
Yes.
And so can you say something about that as a benchmark, and if it still outperforms, even if you count the number of hours that go into it?
I think that's so. I mean, I think you want to definitely think about the welfare implications of this kind of work, right? So one is you could say, hey, you're just giving the top guy the rewards, everybody else is wasted effort, which is one way to think about this. And certainly what we find, we'll give top 5 or top 10, but lots of people participate for the learning aspects around this. So there's, we had in the previous panel, we had a discussion about what the incentives were, what the motives were, and what we find is there's a range of motives to participate. And so people see the problem-solving activity as consumption on its own above and beyond the prize money being created. I think, the hours spent on average, we're finding 40 to 60 hours per solution being put in by one person. Then we just need to add up the math and figure out what that was compared to what happened inside the company. And actually, I haven't done that calculation. So I think hours spent are going to be higher than what happens inside the company. But in the end, from a selfish company point of view, you just want the best solution. You may not typically, if you can create a system that allows you to have lots of people participate, then you may not care about, and you're just paying for the best, then you may not care about it per se.
Good. So I see we have people already lined up. I get, since I'm up here, I get to ask the first sort of question. So most of what I deal with is data that has alpha-stable distributions. So there's long-tail distributions, things that end up even being Cauchy or something like that. And for such distributions, things like the variance is not defined. As they get a little more extreme, the mean is not defined. And so, for instance, a lot of the math that you showed about resampling depends on having some estimate of the mean and the variance. Another way to look at that, though, is that if you do a sample and you try to estimate the means and the variance and check that you've got something okay, you're still likely to have a badly representative thing. In fact, I think it's almost p equals 1 that you have a badly representative thing when you have these long-tailed distributions. And that gets me to you, which is my experience in doing crowd stuff, or almost any sort of machine learning, is you come up with this great solution, and then you try it on the next data set, and it doesn't work, which means you had a bad sample.
Yes.
And so the logic to me is that the generic sort of data I work with are these long-tailed things. I generically get bad samples, which means I generically get bad solutions, which means, oh my God, right? So maybe either one of you want to, Don, you want to start with that, or?
Yeah, well, just to, it's sort of a simplistic answer, but obviously even with Cauchy distributions, you can estimate the centers and the scales in straightforward ways. It's just that method of moments, which is what everybody tends to use, are lousy. Because they don't have any moments, so yes,
right.
They're infinity all the time. But maximum likelihood methods or Bayesian methods often work very well. And so it may be in your problem that you're just not doing the estimation intelligently.
Yeah, well, okay. So that's
a
yeah.
A multivariate Cauchy has this affine invariance going for it. It has a center, it has a scale.
Yeah,
So you can estimate almost anything, just not as easily as with the norm.
Yeah. I mean, the things I've seen say that it takes enormous sample sizes to get good estimates.
Well, if you're using method of moments, that's
No,
obviously true.
using any of the methods that I've
Really?
ever seen, yeah. For these very long...
Maybe twice as big, but that's it. I mean, if you
Well,
do it by
the
maximum
things
likelihood.
I've seen are like 100,000 times bigger. Yeah, for the really long-tailed things. But there is this just sort of phenomenological thing also, which is that you'll get this great solution, but maybe it depends on the particulars of that sample.
Absolutely. So I think we've worked because we've just done so many. We've actually spent a lot of time thinking about how you actually define the right problems and what the metrics are. So certainly the NASA work, like NASA's not going to take the Italian solution and put it up to the space station, right?
We hope.
So what happens is that in those cases, it's the solution approaches that they've implemented matters more than the actual particular implementation used by the Italian guy. And so that in itself for them is very important. Because it opens up a brand new set of solution space for them. And overfitting is always a concern in machine learning contests. I think Kaggle has this, TopCoder has this as well. And then it's really a matter of your contest design. Like you actually have to have the right scoring metric and the right award metric put into place that forces people to actually get you the robust solution across the data sets. And I think Kaggle just had something get published, or I forget where, but again, they're finding very similar types of performance gains with 50 to 60 people working away. So I think it's a matter of contest design more than anything else.
Good. So you guys are queued up?
Yeah, thanks. I have a question. I was very interested by the data about crowdsourcing on TopCoder, and it reminded me of common wisdom, and that is that there's the difference between an average software developer and a very good software developer can really be orders of magnitude. Now, I was wondering if this TopCoder likely attracts a group of people, and maybe they're actually those mythical hacker, ninja, top developers, right?
Yeah, they certainly are.
And that might actually be an alternative explanation, because you explain the difference by just having more samples and taking the maximum of all those samples. But a different explanation might be that we're comparing the performance of a developer cum rocket scientist, or a developer cum whatever, to a really good developer, just that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right, so I think for sure, look, the statistical explanation is devoid of skill in many ways, right? And in fact, quality and skill are correlated, right? So if you think about the fact that if you have this distribution, right, that the quality is going to be correlated with skill. In my work, the reason why I use TopCoder so much is I can control for scale and then look at how the various incentives and that kind of stuff works, right? So all my papers are basically saying, controlling for scale, how do these effects work with incentives? Because in the contest, the first answer you want to give is you've attracted the highly skilled person to make this work. And so I think this is not in any disagreement with you. What this is saying is that if you could get a broad enough skills distribution, right? If you could attract a broad enough skills distribution, then you got 24, 30 draws from it, the likelihood of you getting the top guy goes up, and you're going to get a really high solution. And the thing is, you can't do this inside the university or inside the lab, right? Or inside the company, because you'll just get the average quality solution from the people you hire.
Yeah, you want to?
A follow-up question to that. Do you provide the current accepted answer to the solution to the coders when they start?
It depends on the challenge we're running. Most of the times we don't. We don't want to get them biased.
I was because I would be curious to see what that would affect, if that would actually improve the overall performance, or it might actually just make it so that everybody is doing a little better, but you don't get those really innovative answers that sort of are outside of the box thinking. So
I'll give you an example. We just recently completed an experiment where we basically ran it as a tournament versus a race. Right? Tournament, we just said, we're just going to give you, the best, we're just going to rank order you by performance, and then we're going to do the best solutions. And for race, we established a threshold. We said, we want an X% improvement in quality from what we know is the internal solution. And what we found is that races finished much faster because people just went over the line, got it done, and moved on. Right? So the races were more efficient. So I think the question is, what are your objectives as a sponsor? Like, to get 100,000x or 10x or 20x improvement, maybe a company doesn't want that, right? Maybe a company is better off with a 10% improvement or a 50% improvement and doesn't want to pay for all that kind of a thing, right? And so that's a question of you as a sponsor and the dollars you want to turn in terms of how you want to get the.
Another thing you could try is an iterative process where you run one contest and then you say, this was the best solution.
Yes.
See if you can do even better.
Absolutely, yeah. We're actively thinking about all those kinds of things, exactly.
Good.
So I have a question for Don and then a cheeky question for Karim, a short one. So for Don, sort of repurposing Sandy's question, given these heavy tails online, especially if the covariate you're interested in has something to do with your likelihood of being selected into an experiment, like your level of activity on the website or something like that, does that change not the estimation, but the intelligence of re-randomizing versus blocking in terms of which one is more effective?
No, I don't think so, because the blocking is still it's an intersection method, which is picking allocations, randomized allocations in the corners that are much farther from the center than the other ones. I mean, most of these distributions, usually, even if they're very long tailed, have something like ellipsoidal contours. And so it's just how you do the estimation of that and how you get the metric. I mean, if you have a quotient, I was kind of doubting the factors of 1,000, because if you have a quotient, you have very simple calculations based on EM, show that the efficiency is about half as much for maximum likelihood estimation. And they're just reweighting algorithms that reweight the distances that way. And so I just can't believe if the theoretical things, even for relatively large samples, are 50%, that you go from 50% to 1,000th, 10,000th?
I mean, the question is very extreme, heavy-tailed things, where you don't have the ability to have infinite, essentially large numbers of samples. And the question is, do you get some of the real outliers in there or not? If you get some of the real outliers, if you get a couple of them, it can cause problems. So.
And I guess for Karim, the cheeky question is that it seems like you have these superstar people who are always winning TopCoder. If NASA hired them, would your results flip? That's a great
question. I mean, I think they don't want to work for NASA. Part of the problem is certainly the elites, they're like, no boss? I can do whatever I want to work, and I can get sample from all the TopCoder problems versus just the space station ones. I'd be happy to just pick those.
Sir.
So I found myself wondering if the greatest application of Don's contribution here might not be to experimental design, but to these machine learning competitions. If Netflix Challenge happened to put some important cases only in the training set and not in the test set, then we'd be grading people incorrectly. So
yes.
I wondered if either of you have any comment on that.
I don't know how to even, yes.
Yeah, right. I think that's right. That you, no matter how you allocate people, you're always going to want to avoid bad allocations. Allocations, when you look at them, that say, gee, I didn't want to do that. I don't want to go forward with it.
I think that's exactly right, yeah.
The experimental social scientists are used to thinking about, gee, we want, lower variance of our estimates. But I'm not sure that the machine learning people think in that way, so it might actually be a really useful.
And in fact, it's not just lower variance averaging over all the draws, but lower variance conditional on what you're looking at. Yeah. It's sort of a semi-Bayesian way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
I wanted to try to link the conversation we've been having back to the earlier conversations in the conference as well. And part of this is also going to be naivete, I think. So you were talking, Don, about extending your techniques to the combinatorial 2 to the k case. I think it was maybe Susan yesterday who alluded to the design spaces we're often interested in are continuous, actually. So not even discrete. And I'm fairly sure in Karim's design spaces, he probably would agree that there's kind of an unlimited number of things that one can do. So naivete is, it may be that the Thompson sampling online explore-exploit things that people have been talking about already handle this, and I just don't know. My question is this is a question for Don, but I guess Karim could comment as well, is when we're doing causal inference, we're willing to do inference over the units that were not exposed to the treatment. Are we willing to do inference over the treatment space as well? Is that something that we ever do? Is that a huge no-no? Is that something that's already being done by these online bandits algorithms? I'm not sure.
But we do that all the time in medical experiments. Often goes by the name dose response. You're searching for the right dose, response surface design. So that's an old problem with what you point out, though, is that they're analogs to what I was talking about here that are more complex when you have a quote continuous treatment rather than these discrete treatments. But the same principles carry over. You want the space of those who are exposed at various different levels, at all the different levels of a treatment, to have roughly the same distribution. If the people who get a high dose of a drug look completely different than those who get a medium dose of the drug, you're basing all the conclusions on some extrapolation from a model that you don't trust. So you'd rather have their distribution of background covariates be similar. It's a much harder problem, but the analogs are there.
So I have a question, just one of the things that we run into. So we look at things like prediction markets and investment strategies and things like that. And, you know, if everything is independent and you have a good sample,
Yes.
then you can get good estimates and you beat the hippo in the room.
Yes. Where's Ronnie?
Yeah. But what we also observe is typically, like across hundreds of examples, there are correlations inside the data. So, which in these particular cases, we know something about it. Is somebody paying attention to somebody else who knows that person typically does well. You see, you know, time correlations and things like that, which argue that there are probably information correlations as well. And of course, TopCoder, people get to see what other people are doing, so there might be...
No, in TopCoder,
they don't?
No, they don't. They may get a signal of the frontier of the performance, but that's about it.
I see. So they don't get to see the solution.
They don't get to see the solutions at all. We've run experiments where we've forced the revelation of solutions, but you're working independently on your own, and you just get a signal of like where the frontier is at any given moment in time.
So we've done things where we've tried to estimate these inner sample correlations and essentially whiten them, and find that in things like prediction markets you can do lots better consistently.
Yeah.
But the statistical grounds for that are a little weak because you've got small samples and you've got a lot of things you're looking at. And I wonder if you've thought about that, either of you, that type of thing.
So one of the things, one of the things we've toyed around with, and I don't know if I'll get the IRB on this, is I just wanted to create a fake signal of performance, right? So imagine I've run 100 contests, right? And there's, like, how much of this is like the Bannister effect that we're sort of seeing? So Bannister was the guy who sort of broke the 4-minute mile, right? So we thought 4-minute mile was very difficult to do, nobody could do it, and then he broke it, and then within the next 2 years, lots of people broke the 4-minute mile, right? So there's some kind of a impediment, some view, some paradigm that said you can't break 4-minute mile, all that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering, this is much more behavioral. It's like, you know, if I sort of run a contest and then I sort of have a robot, Karim bot, going in and saying, oh, look at my performance, look at my performance. Is that going to drive the people to start improving performance just based on this, not revealing anything at all about the solution, but just the performance itself? So I think there's some interesting things to be done there. But to your point, I mean, I think certainly in prediction markets there is sort of the follow the guy who we think is going to be really good, and that may actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. And you know, you should be worried about that.
Well, the larger thing, of course, is science, right? So science, we cite each other and things like that. So there's clear sequential effects in there, and it would be nice to and we believe that's good, right?
Yes.
And so the question is, you know, can we come up with a good framework for understanding that, this sort of thing? And if Don, if you have any comments about the sort of sequential.
I think that's right, because there are all sorts of complications when doing experiments with people that we haven't really faced very well, because most randomized experiments were done with plants and animals, and they have to obey. They don't talk to each other very well. But they're all these social experiments. Obviously, there's potential for interference if it's on networks or just on smaller groups, and so I think we're making progress on being able to deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area because, as you said, it hasn't been something we've been able to do, both because of sample size, but also because just the ability to run these big experiments. But yet, that's sort of an analog to what science is and many of the other human activities. Sir.
Karim. So in the cottage industry of contest design literature, of which I'm guilty of, more often than not, a winner-take-all contest is the optimal design. And it's not always true, but Yet I saw in your examples, none of them were winner-take-all. So could you reflect upon, was that sort of a conscious choice? And if so, what's breaking down in like the theory models to real life that makes winner-take-all not desirable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So some of it is just platform preferences. So they're used to, these platforms are, many years old. They have set up a system where they expect at least 2 or 3 people to get rewarded. And so that's, part of that is just like we can't get the platform folks to actually shift along the way. What we have done is we've tried to make the payoffs more skewed. For example, we'll like the top guy will get 95, 96%, and the second person will get 3% or 5% or whatever it is. But we haven't, at least my research program hasn't sort of tried to sort of say winner take all versus, there's so much low-hanging fruit in this space that we haven't gone after that per se, and comparing winner take all versus a different type of setup experimentally.
I just wanted to actually say that actually I see a lot of motivational benefits for these contests. One of my students and I won one of these prizes for the KDD Cup, and so I saw the massive effort output of my graduate students as they get into this motivationally. Yeah. And so I think we actually as a group here should actually think about what are the data sets that actually we could actually be competing with that would also provide good science. And so, because sometimes the competitions that we were actually going for weren't actually really maybe all that important. And so figuring out what's actually important is, I think, really important. So most of the comment. To Dan, I think actually several of us, and coming back to the first question you got, actually, how do you actually do this re-randomization if you're actually randomizing on the fly per user? And I think you alluded to possibly a method, and I bet, do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because I didn't get it.
About the re-randomization in a
sequential
context.
Well, and because if someone's running a platform where they're randomizing users at a time, or maybe I think maybe the answer is figure out actually this sequence well ahead of time across all covariates ahead of time and store that sequence.
No, because you typically don't in the sequential setting, you don't have all the covariates measured on the people who are coming in, for example. And so you have to do it more on the fly. And obviously to the extent that you can do the re-randomization in blocks, it becomes easier. So if the blocks are just everybody, well, that's just simple re-randomization. If, on the other hand, if the blocks are size 1, you randomize the next person to the next group with probability that increases the balance. So you can do it. And again, there are enormous number of low-hanging fruit for doing math on that, because I just described the bounds. I give you 2 bounds on it. You wait till the end and get everybody, or you do it one at a time. And that bounds all the things in between.
We've done things like with a block size of 1, right? Yeah. Essentially what you've got 2 to the k little trackers that are trying to bias your sample so that you get something that's halfway reasonable at the end.
And the problem with that, statistically or inferentially, is that if it's size 1, then it almost becomes deterministic and you have no randomization left.
You have to be,
And so you can't get honest.
You have to be inefficient about it, right? Yeah.
So you prefer samples of size 2 or something like that, so you can get some randomization in there, so you can get honest p-values.
Sir.
Hi, I have a question for Don. I was wondering if the method also defines limits on how greedy you can be in terms of how small the limits you want to set, both on the differences between the different covariates and the number of different covariates that you could test. So I was wondering if you had thought about that, and if there's a formal way to think about greediness in this context.
Yes, sure. And in fact, if you have a lot of covariates and they're not really continuous, but they're discrete, you end up getting rid of all the randomization, because there is an optimal design they just sort of pick, and you don't want to pick the optimal, because there are trade-offs. I mean, it may give you the most precision, but then you don't know how precise it is. You don't know how to measure the precision. So that's a relatively open-ended question, but there's certain bounds on that are low-hanging fruit. But the more complicated questions are probably difficult to address, at least formally.
Sir.
Yeah, so a question that maybe connects these two things, and kind of related to the previous question as well, that one of the things that's been amazing about these machine learning contests, et cetera, is that they bring out all this additional talent, and maybe we learn some techniques that end up being really valuable for that. But I think I also agree with Don that design has been really sort of underrated and underexplored. So what are the ways that we could actually make some of those kind of contests work for doing things like experimental design? It's harder to give people immediate feedback because sometimes we don't know what design is actually going to work until you really run an experiment. In other cases, you might be able to simulate some of these designs. So I just wonder, what tools might we have to try to innovate more rapidly in things like high-dimensional experimental design where there maybe hasn't been enough innovation?
I think that's a great question, and 'cause I think very little has been done on that. In fact, for probably decades, the whole area of experimental design in statistics is often thought as being dead, because everybody did everything for it, over the last 50 years. But in fact, everybody's doing it under sort of a linear model, and have different versions of optimality that are all based on normality, D-optimality, A-optimality, which is looking at the eigenstructure of variance covariance matrices. We're just so simple-minded that it is dead. That area is dead. But I think the new ideas that open up the design to rely on computing lots of different things is pretty much wide open. But I haven't heard anything dealing with how you propose a contest for design. I think it's a great idea, though.
So maybe the conference organizers might want to think about how you might want to understand some common challenges across all of the researchers, and we should think about running some contests around that. I mean, I think it will get this community motivated, but also attract lots of other solvers as well.
I mean, the part that I'm most personally concerned about is that in a typical thing, you have certain features that you're given in some sense, right? And those features give you a perspective on the problem that you're interested in. But they're not necessarily optimal or lots of other sort of properties. And so I always tell my students, don't believe something until you can get essentially the same result, but with completely different measurement techniques and completely different features. And that's a sort of Kolmogorov sort of view of things, is that you want, the core explanation that you can see from many different points of view. So an interesting thing for me would be, can we find phenomena where we can get very different sorts of data sets about them and ask, do the answers differ between them? Almost certainly. I think it would be instructive to see. Are there good techniques for sampling that way? How would you even think about that? It's not clear to me.
And there's also the very obvious mathematical questions you could address. Let's suppose that you had a real contest and you looked at the extremes and you got the answers you got. And let's suppose they now had 10 million monkeys.
Yes.
Yeah.
How would they do?
Yes.
They do even better.
Yes, maybe.
Right, yeah.
If they knew how to write the code.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, but they randomly generated code.
Yes,
and
Python,
they have,
yes.
100 million monkeys, they probably get, probably the best would be pretty good.
Yes.
So you have to have some idea of replication.
Yes.
Somewhere. I think that's what was being said here.
Yeah. So we're at 6:15, but since you walked all the way up there, you get one last quick question. Quick question?
Yeah, so this is for Karim. You might think that if you ran a bunch of contests over and over and over again, you'd get one or two people that might keep winning, like some superstars. And then I work for Facebook, we might go and try to hire them.
Yes. And Facebook actually sponsors TopCoder stuff, right?
Yeah, we do. So I'm kind of curious to think about what the long run dynamics, what contests continue to work, because my incentive as an employee is to actually maybe take a lower risk option, which is to work for a company that will pay me when I'm not always the winner of the contest. Yeah. And so the people participating in contests might not always be draws from the same distribution over time.
Yeah, so if you remember so that's a great question. So, and TopCoder started as a platform to place people into companies, right? And the anecdotal experience for them is actually very interesting. Like some of the top, when Google ran some challenges, Google has a whole bunch of very high-rated TopCoder folks working. Their folks said, no, we want to compete as well, because they weren't being challenged enough inside of Google. Right, so because for them it's okay, there's not enough I'm doing search algorithms once again, whatever, and so what we found is that there's just given the variety of problems that are posted on this open platform, that even the folks that are working inside of companies want to actually participate and do these kinds of things. So there's no talent drain per se. But the second thing is, which has been very interesting, is that the NASA, the Space Station Challenge showed you that, in fact, there wasn't much difference in the performance, right, of the algorithm. So like between the first and the 30th, there wasn't that much difference. It was literally, just a rounding error in terms of decibels, right? And so even if the top guys go away, there's a bulk of people that are, again, available to work and participate. And we've done analysis on the platform where they, in the 2008 financial crisis, they had to cut their prizes by 50%, right? They cut their prizes by 50%, so all the Western European and Americans stopped participating, but then we were made up by the Chinese and Eastern Europeans, right? And so you want to think about a dynamic game, so there may be the top guys may be aging out and going away, but new folks keep entering, and there's a host of reasons for them to keep participating.
Good. So well, I'll just put one. So also there's now a bunch of startups that claim to be able to get in the top couple percent, like of the Kaggle competitions regularly.
Yes.
So that means, you put the data in, you hit carriage return, you get an answer.
That's right.
Okay, well, that changes the game a lot. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
We have reception and wonderful posters. Please come.